The meeting room is quiet, not the good kind of quiet, the kind that happens after something breaks. You are standing in front of your team.
All right, everyone.
The project you led for months just collapsed. The client is gone. The numbers are wrong. The deadline passed. It does not matter which one it was. What matters is that every person in that room is looking at you right now, waiting to see what you do next. This is the moment that separates two completely different kinds of leader. Not the ones who never face failure. Every leader faces failure. The separation happens in the 10 seconds after the room goes silent. In those 10 seconds, something is revealed that no resume, no title, and no track record can fake. The Stoics called it the capacity to hold, not to pretend nothing happened, not to perform calm while falling apart inside, but to genuinely absorb pressure without letting it corrupt your next decision. Marcus Aurelius did it while managing an empire at war. Epictetus built his entire philosophy around it as a man who owned nothing. Seneca wrote about it from inside one of the most dangerous courts in Roman history. What they understood about pressure, leadership, and the architecture of a mind that never breaks is exactly what this video is about. Chapter 1. What pressure actually reveals. There is a belief that most leaders carry without ever examining it. The belief that pressure is the enemy. That if you could just reduce the chaos, simplify the variables, and control the environment, you would finally be able to perform at the level you know you are capable of. The Stoics would tell you that belief is the problem. Epictetus, who was born a slave and spent the first decades of his life owning nothing, not his time, not his body, not his freedom, built an entire philosophy around a single observation. Pressure does not create what is inside a person. It reveals what was already there. The fire does not make the gold. It shows you whether what you have is gold at all. For a modern leader, this is not a comfortable idea. It means that the version of yourself that appears when the project collapses, when the client walks, when the team is looking at you in silence, that version is not an exception. It is not the result of bad circumstances or bad timing. It is the most accurate picture of who you have actually built yourself to be. This is where most leadership content stops being useful. It tells you how to manage the crisis. It gives you frameworks, communication templates, and the escalation strategies. What it does not tell you is that none of those tools work if the person holding them has not done the internal work first. Epictetus taught that there are things within our control and things outside it. Our judgments, our responses, our values, our choices. Those are ours. Everything else, the market, the client, the team's reaction, the timing, belongs to a different category entirely. The leader who has not made that separation with precision will always be at the mercy of whatever the external world decides to do next. This is not Stoic passivity. This is Stoic architecture. You are not removing yourself from the situation. You are building the internal structure that determines how you meet it. Chapter 2. The leadership principle Marcus Aurelius used every day. Marcus Aurelius was not a philosopher who became an emperor. He was an emperor who refused to stop being a philosopher. That distinction matters more than it sounds. He managed an empire of 70 million people during one of the most turbulent periods in Roman history. The Antonine Plague was killing thousands every day. The northern frontier was under constant military pressure. The Senate required careful political navigation. His own family created complications that no leadership manual has ever adequately addressed. And through all of it, he wrote, not for publication, not for posterity, for himself every morning as a practice of mental calibration before the day began. What he returned to more than any other idea in the Meditations was a discipline so simple it is easy to dismiss and so difficult to execute that most people never actually do it. The discipline of separating, with surgical precision, what depends on him from what does not. Modern psychology calls this the locus of control. The Stoics called it the dichotomy of control. Marcus Aurelius called it the thing he had to remind himself of every single morning, because the weight of empire made it easy to forget. For a leader managing a team in crisis, this principle is not abstract. It is the most practical tool available in the 10 seconds after the room goes silent. Because in those 10 seconds, the mind does something automatic and destructive. It tries to control everything at once. The client's perception, the team's morale, the timeline, the budget, the reputation, the outcome. And the moment a leader tries to control everything, they effectively control nothing. What Marcus Aurelius practiced, and what the meditations document with uncomfortable honesty, is the act of narrowing focus to what actually responds to your decisions. Your tone, your next sentence, your choice of whether to react or to respond, your decision about what information the team needs right now versus what can wait. Everything outside that boundary is real. It matters. But it does not belong in your hands in this moment, and treating it as if it does will cost you the only thing you actually control. In Book 5 of the Meditations, Marcus writes that a man's life is what his thoughts make it, not what his circumstances make it, not what his enemies make it, not what the market makes it. His thoughts. For a leader standing in front of a team that just watched something fail, that sentence is either the most useful thing anyone has ever said to you, or it sounds like philosophy that has never met a real deadline. The difference between those two reactions is exactly what this video is about. Chapter 3. The Stoic Discipline of Response. Seneca wrote his most important work under conditions that most modern leaders would find unbearable. He served as advisor to Nero, one of the most volatile and dangerous rulers in Roman history. A man who executed family members, persecuted political rivals, and operated with a kind of unpredictability that made every day a potential final day. Seneca had no exit. He had influence, wealth, and proximity to power, and none of it guaranteed his safety for a single morning. What he developed inside those conditions was not a strategy for managing Nero. That was largely impossible. What he developed was a discipline of response, so refined that his internal state remained navigable regardless of what the external environment decided to do. In his letters on ethics, Seneca returns repeatedly to a distinction that most people collapse into a single category: the distinction between an impulse and a decision. An impulse is automatic. It is the body's first reaction to threat, to humiliation, to failure, to the silence of a room full of people waiting to see if you are going to hold. A decision is what happens in the space between that impulse and the action that follows. Most leaders in crisis never find that space. The impulse arrives and the action follows so quickly that it feels like one thing. The voice gets louder. The language gets defensive. The posture closes. The team reads all of it before a single word is spoken, and what they read is not confidence. What they read is a leader who has lost the thread. Seneca's discipline was the deliberate expansion of that space, not the suppression of the impulse, which is neither possible nor useful, but the insertion of a pause long enough to ask one question. What does this situation actually require from me right now? That question sounds deceptively simple. In practice, under real pressure, with real stakes and real people watching, it is one of the most difficult things a leader can train themselves to do consistently. Because the impulse always has an answer ready. It is loud, it is fast, and it feels like clarity. Seneca knew that feeling well. He also knew it was almost always wrong. The leaders who never break are not the ones who feel no impulse. They are the ones who have practiced the pause long enough that it becomes the first move, instead of something they remember to do afterward, when it is already too late. Chapter 4. Your team is watching what you radiate, not what you say. There is something that happens in a room when a leader loses their internal stability. It does not announce itself. Nobody stands up and says the atmosphere just changed. but everyone feels it simultaneously, and the effect moves through a team faster than any memo, any meeting, or any carefully prepared statement ever could. Marcus Aurelius understood this not as a management concept, but as a practical reality of command. An emperor who visibly fractures under pressure does not just damage his own credibility. He damages the structural confidence of everyone who depends on his judgment. The army that sees its general panic does not fight harder to compensate. It fights with one eye on the exit. Modern organizational psychology has a term for what Marcus Aurelius was describing 2,000 years ago: co-regulation. The process by which the nervous system of one person, particularly a person in a position of authority, directly influences the emotional state of the people around them. Leaders are not just responsible for decisions. They are responsible for the emotional climate those decisions are made inside of. This is where Stoic practice becomes something more than personal discipline. It becomes a leadership instrument. When you have done the internal work of separating what you control from what you do not, when you have developed Seneca's discipline of response, when you have built the habit of narrowing your focus to the next right action, rather than grasping at everything simultaneously, the result is not just that you feel more stable. The result is that your team feels more stable because of you. Epictetus taught that the only thing we ever truly exhibit to the world is the quality of our own judgments. Not our intentions, not our track record, not our title. In a moment of crisis, your team is not reading your resume. They are reading the quality of your presence in real time. They are asking a question they will never say out loud. Is this person going to hold? The answer you give them is not verbal. It is everything else. The pace of your breathing, the steadiness of your voice, the quality of your attention. Whether you are fully in the room or already somewhere else managing the story you are going to tell later. A leader who has internalized Stoic principles does not perform calm. Performance is visible, and teams are not fooled by it for long. What they radiate is something different. It is the genuine stability of a person who has already done the work of accepting what cannot be changed and is now entirely focused on what can. That is what your team is waiting to feel from you in the 10 seconds after the room goes silent. Not a speech, not a plan, not reassurance, presence. And presence, the Stoics would tell you, is entirely within your control. Chapter 5. The Stoic Solution to Chronic Pressure. There is a version of leadership burnout that nobody talks about honestly. Not the dramatic collapse, not the public breakdown, not the moment where everything falls apart in front of the team. Those moments are visible, and they get addressed because they have to be. The version that actually destroys most high performers is quieter. It is the accumulation of 1,000 small moments of pressure that never fully resolved. The decision you made at 11 at night that you are still second-guessing at 3 in the morning. The conversation you had with a difficult stakeholder that you replayed for days afterward. The quarter that closed below target, and the weight of that number that followed you into the next one. None of these are dramatic enough to trigger intervention. All of them are heavy enough over time to erode the very internal structure that your leadership depends on. Seneca wrote about this erosion with a precision that feels less like ancient philosophy and more like a clinical description of modern executive life. In his Letters on Ethics, he observed that the mind which is never given space to return to itself becomes a mind that is perpetually reactive. Not because the person is weak, but because sustained pressure without recovery is not a test of character. It is a consumption of it. This is the distinction that most leadership culture refuses to make. There is a significant difference between pressure that builds capacity and pressure that depletes it. The first has recovery built into the cycle. The second does not. And a leader who cannot tell the difference between the two will eventually discover it the hard way, usually at the worst possible moment, in front of the people who most need them to hold. Marcus Aurelius dealt with this across 19 years on the throne. The Meditations are not a record of a man who had solved the problem of sustained pressure. They are a record of a man who had developed a daily practice precise enough to keep the erosion from becoming collapse. He wrote every morning, not because he had things to say, but because the act of writing was the recovery itself, the return to principle. The re-establishment of what mattered before the day began pulling him in every direction at once. Epictetus framed the same practice differently. He taught that a person who does not regularly examine their own judgments, who does not deliberately return to their core principles and test their daily actions against them, is not resting between pressures. They are simply accumulating damage between exposures. For the modern high performer, this translates into something concrete and uncomfortable. Recovery is not the absence of work. It is the presence of a practice. Something deliberate, regular, and non-negotiable that returns you to your own internal foundation before the next demand arrives. Without it, you are not managing chronic pressure. You are surviving it, temporarily, until you are not. The leaders who never break over the long term are not the ones with the highest tolerance for pressure. They are the ones who understood early enough that tolerance without recovery is not strength. It is a slower version of the same collapse. Chapter 6. The principle no leadership course will ever teach you. Marcus Aurelius lost things that would have broken most people permanently. He lost children. He lost generals he trusted. He lost years of his reign to a plague that killed thousands while he was simultaneously fighting wars on multiple frontiers. He did not lose these things quietly or easily. The meditations make clear that he felt them fully, that the weight was real, and that he never pretended otherwise, even in his most private writing. What he refused to do was allow the loss to contaminate the next decision. This is the principle that no leadership course teaches, because it cannot be packaged into a framework or delivered in a workshop. It is not a technique. It is a capacity that is built slowly, through repeated practice, in the small moments long before the large ones arrive. Epictetus called it the ability to take the appropriate action given what is, not given what you wish were true, not the situation you planned for, not the outcome you deserved, not the timeline that would have been fair. The situation as it actually exists right now in front of you, with the resources and the people and the time that are actually available. Most leaders in the aftermath of failure are making decisions inside a version of reality that no longer exists. They are compensating for what was lost, defending against what happened, or managing the story of what should have been. None of that is the situation. All of it costs judgment that the actual situation urgently needs. Seneca wrote that the wise man loses nothing because he holds nothing as truly his own except his capacity to respond well. For a leader, this is not a call to detachment. It is a call to precision. The project that failed was real. The client that left mattered. The trust that was damaged is worth rebuilding. None of that changes the fact that your next decision needs to be made from clarity, not from grief, not from ego, and not from need to immediately restore a version of events that no longer exists. The leaders who never break do not break because they have learned to absorb loss without letting it rewrite their judgment. That capacity is not a personality trait. It is a practice. And like every practice the Stoics ever described, it begins long before you need it. The leader you are building right now, go back to that meeting room. The same silence, the same team, the same collapsed project, and the same 10 seconds where everything is decided. Nothing about the external situation has changed. The client is still gone. The numbers are still wrong. The pressure is still real. But something is different now, and the difference is not in the room. It is in you. You know that pressure does not create character. It reveals it, which means the only question worth asking is not how to avoid the moment, but who you are building yourself to be before it arrives. You know that Marcus Aurelius, managing an empire at war, returned every morning to the same discipline, separating what belonged to him from what did not. narrowing his focus to the next right action, rather than grasping at everything simultaneously. Not because he was naturally calm, because he had built a practice precise enough to produce clarity under conditions that would have destroyed a less prepared mind. You know that Seneca's discipline of response lives in the space between the impulse and the action. That space is not given to you. It is built. Deliberately, repeatedly, in the small moments that do not feel important until the large one arrives, and you discover exactly how wide that space has become. You know that your team is not reading your words in a crisis. They are reading your presence, and presence is entirely within your control. You know that chronic pressure without recovery is not a test of strength. It is a consumption of it, and that the leaders who last are not the ones with the highest tolerance for damage, but the ones who understood early enough that recovery is not weakness. It is maintenance of the only instrument you actually lead with. And you know that loss does not have to contaminate judgment, that the next decision can be made from clarity even when the last outcome was painful, that this is not detachment, it is precision. The Stoics did not write for people who had easy lives. They wrote for people who carried real weight, made real decisions, and needed something more durable than motivation to get through it. That is what these principles are, not inspiration that fades by Monday. A structure that holds. The question is not whether pressure is coming. It is whether you will be ready when it does.